The Penre Papers. A Journey Through the Multiverse. The Second Level of Learning. http://wespenre.com. Genesis Paper Number 7, The Atlanteans and the Misuse of Energy by Penre, Sunday, September 9, 2012, http://wespenre.com. 6. Lucifer's Rebellion and his Pleiadian Angels. Lucifer's rebellion, as it is described in the Urantia book and other older scriptures, occurred long before Earth was even created. We have already talked about earlier that Ea/Poseidon is the Aryan prince who rebelled against the god, Des, in heaven. Ea in this sense is Lucifer, while Enlil is Satan, despite the fact that I wrote that Marduk probably is Satan in level I, who also rebelled against the forces of light, the mother goddess, and they were both cast out of heaven, Orion, by Archangel Michael, who of course must have been an Aryan Makh warrior, or perhaps the symbol for a whole Aryan elite force. Both Lucifer and Satan had their followers, and whether they were Satan's followers, or Lucifer's, they were all what we call fallen angels. The Urantia book distinguish between Satan, Lucifer, and the devil. They are clearly three different personalities translated into hidden history. The devil, Caligastia, corresponds best with Marduk, Ea's son, even if the Urantia book doesn't clearly tell us so. Marduk, just like Caligastia, was later killed here on Earth, and Alexander the Great, who is said to have been Marduk's hybrid son, saw his father dead in a coffin. However, because these star beings jump bodies, Marduk didn't stay dead for long. In the Urantia book, paper 53, it says that there was no obvious reason for Lucifer to rebel against the system, and no one suggested such a rebellion to him. The book suggests that Lucifer simply was an advocate of self-assertion and liberty. His manifesto became to teach humankind that the god, Des, did not exist, which became more prominent after the flood, when different religions took form after first had been instigated by Ea's high priests. Eventually, worshipping or dedicating oneself to the mother goddess religion became outlawed or ridiculed, and spiritual darkness reigned on earth. If humans who possessed the fire could freely apply their religion, it could clearly become a threat to the authority. Therefore, the knowledge of the women of fire and the original goal for the human experiment became extremely hidden and only known by a select few, on a need-talk-know basis. But more about this later. What is known is that Ea preferred the Syrian lifestyle and lived most of his life with his stepfather, Anu. He plotted with Satan, Enlil, and put their plan into action and descended to earth. However, there were also Vegans, from the Lyra star system, who supported Ea and Enlil in their rebellion against the mother goddess. This faction of Lyran heritage fled to the Pleiades during the wars in heaven and resided there ever since. So at one point during the Atlantean era, Ea left Earth and went back to the Pleiades to bring some of his loyal officers back with him to Earth. In the Pleiades he showed them holograms of how life was on Earth and that he wanted to use the Lyran/Pleiadian DNA to further advance humankind. When some of the Pleiadians saw how beautiful these women of fire, and women in general, were, they said, "Let's go down there and have sex." So, instead of just contributing with their DNA to Ea directly while staying in the Pleiades, 199 Pleiadians followed Ea back to Earth to have sex with human women, but also to help Ea with his genetic experiments. These were the 200 fallen angels, Ea included, the Watchers whom are mentioned in the Book of Enoch. Like we discussed earlier, they nano-traveled to here in spirit, took human male bodies, and seduced women to have sex with them. It clearly states in the booklet The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which is allegedly originating from the 12 sons of Jacob, that it was not the Watchers in the shape of giants who seduced Earth women. In fact, just like I have emphasized here in my Level 2 papers, aliens nano-travel through space but have the ability to shape-shift their avatars. Thus, the Pleiadians could manifest as human males and have sex with our women even before they'd had time to genetically create their own human bodies or take baby bodies and grow up here like any normal human. They started with having sex with women in thought in their minds, but the encounters became more and more physical. Thus they allured the watchmen before the flood, for as these continually beheld them, they lusted after them and conceived the act in their mind, for they changed themselves into the shape of men and appeared to them when they were with their husbands, and the women, lusting in their minds after their forms, gave birth to giants. In the Bible it says they came down here as beautiful male angels, irresistible to many human females. It's said they had wings and muscular, attractive bodies. This may very well be true, because with your avatar you can manifest as anything you want if you know how to do it. However, this did not create giant offspring, or any offspring at all for that matter, because using avatars is not like using 3D bodies, it's more like a solid hologram. After a while, the Pleiadians genetically engineered their own 3D bodies, with or without wings, but more commonly, their souls hovered over human females, whom they knew would carry good-looking male offspring, and made sure their soul inhabited the chosen fetus. That way, the fallen ones could be born into human bodies, just like you and I, but grow up with full memories and interdimensional abilities. I am sure these same beings are coming back today and in fact are already here, born into regular human bodies. More than just having sex with human females, they followed EA down to his laboratories under the ocean and they started manipulating Lyran/Pleiadian DNA, the DNA of giants. These offspring became the biblical Nephilim and spread out over the world and settled down both in Mu and Atlantis, among other places, approximately at the same time. 7. Genetic experiments out of mind. Lord Enlil was never happy with this new creation. He talked to EA and expressed his concern that there were too many chefs and it defeated the purpose with the whole experiment. Besides, the Nephilim had a tendency to stick their nose in everything and were degraded compared to the humans. EA told his brother to bide his time. This was just the beginning of a test experiment, and if it didn't work, EA would discontinue it. This was not the only experiment EA had going, he told the Syrian overlord. Enlil left after giving EA a long look. Enlil was right, however, although he himself used giants frequently for different kinds of missions, often as a police force or a military force. Lord Enlil was their commander. Get the implications of today's military as well, where we still use the term commander. Ponder the meaning of commander in today's world. These giants were unpredictable. Some of them, who had more Syrian genes than others, were quite aggressive, and eventually went into cannibalism, while others were mellower and began a positive relationship with humans. Again, EA in all his elitist manner, picked out some of the wisest and most trustworthy of the Nephilim to rule kingdoms in certain parts of the world. The more aggressive ones were recruited by EA's selected human hybrids, from here on called the Bloodlines Def, and used as military leaders and front soldiers in battles. One such giant was the infamous Goliath. The Tzadikite documents, also called the Damascus documents, or the Damascus rules, who are supposedly the most interesting of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, tell the story of how the children of the fallen angels fell, as well as their parents, the Watchers. Because they walked in the stubbornness of their hearts, the Watchers of heaven fell. 8. Yet, they were caught thereby because they kept not the commandments of God. So too their sons, whose height was like the lofty cedars and whose bodies were as mountains. 9. They also fell. The earth must have been a very strange place, indeed, in these days, with all these prototypes walking around on the surface and underground. It seems like EA and Nin were greatly inspired to experiment after the Pleiadians came, and humans were crossed with animals again, but this time in even more sophisticated ways. One could see human bodies with bull heads, a Pleiadian trait, bird heads, more Pleiadian, and other grotesque abnormalities. 8. Misuse of energy. What do we mean, exactly, when we talk about misuse of energy? Well, in Atlantis, just like today, it's done in many different ways, but mostly through advanced technology and misuse of sexual energies. There is nothing wrong with technology, if we wish to remain an advanced society who wants some kind of assistance with managing our basic needs on a comfortable level. Certain technology can be beneficial. Some say the washing machine is the greatest invention of mankind. I don't know if I agree, but I can't really argue with it. Either it is a great invention. There are other great inventions that mankind could take advantage of. Many of them were developed by Nikola Tesla, whose inventions were taken over and misused by the government. However, some researchers have started to look into Tesla some more and have begun to take off the god spell of this man by showing that Tesla to some larger or lesser degree was working with the government on some not so benevolent projects. Time will tell to what extent that may have been. When technology is being used to control others, for warfare, spying, and mind control etc., or only accessible to a few selected groups, it's starting to get misused. With Syrians present, this has a tendency to always happen. It's up to we humans to see through their manipulation, or we will end up in a much worse situation than the Atlanteans did. At least they were stopped by the flood, or we would probably not be here today. I am not excusing how Enlil manipulated events to create the deluge. I am just saying that when the Syrians have a finger in things, they really go out of hand after a while. It always seems inevitable. This is why I don't trust them, in spite of what people say. In Atlantis, the technology was a little different from the one we are using today, but there are also similarities. We have already mentioned the computers, but they also had space technology, of course, and a wealth of knowledge about the stars and the universe in general. They fed off fear, and in addition to setting up the grid and the trap system, they also used technology to control people's minds and their thoughts. A relatively small population, which yet hadn't reached 1 billion, was much easier to control than today's 7 billion people. They taught humans about warfare and instigated wars to create mass events which the Syrians could energetically feed off. Sometimes the wars were for that purpose only, and sometimes it was over real estate, or some petty conflict between Syrian authorities. This was nothing new. The Syrians, just like we humans, couldn't even be peaceful with each other, and conflicts and wars were very common. Just like Zecharia Sitchin so well describes in his book, The Wars of Gods and Men, they used human soldiers as cannon fodder for their silly wars, which sometimes could start because of jealousy between gods, or just as a show-off, who was the most powerful and fearless. The jealousy between the gods of Sirius is well documented, so we don't need to go into details here. We know that crystals had a lot to do with it, because crystals, especially the ones they called pronounced mesh, contain memory and knowledge. They were also a communication device between gods, almost like today's cell phones, but they worked on longer distances. Today's cell phone is watered-down Atlantean technology, by the way, but we can see how quickly our cell phones get more and more advanced, like if someone has epiphanies after epiphanies and invents new technology on a weekly basis. Of course, this is not the case. The cell phone technology, the way it's intended to be used in the future, is already fully developed since long. In fact, it's not human inventions, but achieved via TTP-DEF, technology transfer programs. In the Atlantean times, the gods fought over these devices to steal knowledge from each other and to get access to each other's secrets. It was such a big deal that people got killed over them, as discussed in details in Level I. 9. The Wars of Gods and Men. In contrast to Enlil, Lord Ea was somewhat pleased with his own and the Pleiadians' creation of giants. They were impressive and could be used for both labor, teaching, military purposes, and to rule. More and more so, Ea started putting pure-blooded human hybrids to rule over some smaller kingdoms. However, as time went by, some of these kings showed to be quite skilled in warfare, and were quite curious explorers. While the kingdoms of Atlantis had formed over the millennia, other tribes, which Ea had told to spread out over the world, had formed their own cities and kingdoms in different parts of the planet, mostly minding their own business. However, as we have discussed earlier, fear is something the Syrians feed off, and it became important to instigate these kinds of survival emotions in ignorant humans, who didn't have the wisdom of shamans and high priests/priestesses. The problem with elitism is that power corrupts, so the Lemurian cultures, or many or them, were quite unique in the sense that they could still keep a good relationship between the priesthood and the people. Not so in many other parts of the world, there it was more an exception than a rule that this unique relationship prevailed. Soon enough, and as a part of the plan, the shamanic leadership started taking advantage of the power they felt they had due to the knowledge and wisdom they possessed and began campaigns to dumb down the people. This was part of EA's genius. He understood the human mindset, because he had created it. Hence, he didn't have to be there for this particular elitism to develop, it became a natural process on the most part. By whispering secrets to a chosen few, they automatically felt they were God's chosen people, and therefore for more than the rest of mankind. When this was achieved, fear, uncertainty, and confusion could be instigated into these societies. The priesthoods told the people that there were dangers out there in the woods, other tribes were hostile and could any time come and kill or kidnap you, there were monsters and unseen forces everywhere who could engulf you, and the list goes on. People became quite superstitious and gave their power away to the priesthood, who became their protectors from evil. The priesthood became more powerful, and this power in its turn was used by the Syrians, who stole it from the priesthood by feeding off the vibrations of fear amongst the general people, and by sucking energy from the priesthood, only to let them keep enough to feel they were for more than the people. Then, when this basic structure was in place, the rest was easy. The kings, whether they were direct hybrid sons of Ea, or hybrids of the second or third generation, could easily manipulate the masses. And the best way to feed off fear and terror is through warfare and conquest. Thus, wars and conflicts became commonplace, and the Atlantic Empire with its 10 major kingdoms started conquering other parts of the world to expand their domains. Thus, parts of today's Egypt and Western Europe were conquered and fell under the banner of the Atlantic kings. Already existing cities or kingdoms were either totally destroyed and everyone was killed or driven off, or they surrendered and became part of Atlantis, many of the conquered people becoming slaves under the Atlantean kings. In addition to the above, grotesque and horrific rituals were performed by the Syrians, many times as revenge when one Syrian family was in dispute with another, or just to show off their power. When I first read about this as Sitchin's The Wars of Gods and Men, I was stunned over their cruelty and total lack of love and compassion. I wrote about this in Level I, but for those who really want to understand the Syrian mindset in this regard, I would suggest they read this particular Sitchin book. 10. Experiment Contaminated. So far, so good. Lord Enlil didn't mind that the Atlanteans expanded eastward, because he and his people were mostly settled in South Africa, South America, and the Near and Middle East. His own main residence was in Mesopotamia, today's Iraq. Besides, he took advantage of all the bloodshed that took place and fed off of it like everybody else amongst the gods. Until one day, when he started getting threatened. Shuruppak was a city situated about 35 miles south of Nippur on the banks of the Euphrates in modern Iraq. It was later, after the flood, dedicated to Enlil, who was Enlil's Aryan wife. Although none of the two particularly dwelled there in Atlantean days, it was located deadly close to Enlil's main residence. So, when one day around 49,000 BC, Ea decided to put one of his hybrid kings of the throne of Shuruppak, because it was strategically located and would be a perfect outpost in the little game called war that he played, this infuriated Enlil. First of all, this was way too close to home, and also, he thought that Ea gave his hybrids way too much power and had given them too much knowledge. In other words, he felt threatened that the humans would become more and more like the gods. In addition, he had a lot to say about the Pleiadian experiment, which he saw as a contamination of the original Aryan/Syrian experiment that he and Ea had planned and started. He told Ea that the giants were like monstrous savages who ruined the genetic library. He accused his brother for having abandoned their plan and started working with the Pleiadians in favor of the Syrians and therefore started his own experiment, and by doing so, polluted the original one. Ea defended himself and said that the original plan was still in effect and the creation of the Nephilim would not interfere with their common goal. Enlil, however, thought Ea was wrong and started plotting against humanity, letting his own plans take shape in his head, plans which would eventually lead to the demise of mankind. So, he started his own war against the Atlanteans and included heavier battery in his warfare. Thus, we had the conflict between the Enlilites and the Inkites, the Ram clan and the Serpent clan, respectively. See the first level of learning. One of Enlil's purposes was to use mankind as foot soldiers and simply let them destroy each other. Ea could see what Enlil was trying to do, but the Lord of Command was determined. Ea's son, Marduk, who supported his father, were at this point the king in Babylon, not too far from Enlil's domains. Half Syrian, from his mother, and half Aryan, from his father, Marduk was more aggressive than his father and started fighting back more ferociously than Ea had anticipated. In fact, Ea wanted to re-establish peace between the clans to save his creations. Wars and battles came and went, but wars didn't kill off enough humans to put an end to the experiment, Enlil noticed. Ea had let humans breed without restrictions, and the population grew exponentially all over the world. Unless Enlil used nuclear weapons, mankind, like a virus, would increase in numbers and contaminate the planet. Not to speak of the giants. Enlil had to reconsider. So for a while, the wars were not as intense anymore, although they never totally stopped because they had become self-propelled by people's ideas of each other, and who was superior to whom. Marduk, still located in Babylon, gathered a lot of humans around him, loving the fact that he was being worshipped, and he ruled Babylon with an iron fist. In the meantime, Ea, who was known to be pretty promiscuous with human females, both for the purpose of sex in general, but also of course to gain power from sacred sexual rituals, had lots of affairs. From one of these escapades, a human hybrid was born. His name was Utnapishtim, better known as Noah. He became one of Ea's favorites, and in his adult years he resided with Ea's son Marduk in Babylon. Enlil didn't like that Marduk gathered so many humans around him, not trusting his intentions and anticipating a future attack from Marduk. So, when Marduk was on a mission in another part of the world, Enlil used as authority his title as the Lord of Commands and decided to starve the Babylonians to death by cutting off their communication systems and let no food supplies reach them from outside. He also refused to give aid to sick people in Babylon. Utnapishtim, however, managed to get a message out to his father, Ea, about what was happening in Babylon. The kingdom was now basically occupied by Enlil. Also, Utnapishtim tried to tell the people to stop worshipping the gods and grant themselves more power over their own lives. Still, it was fruitless, because very few dared to go against Enlil's authority. Ea, however, started smuggling in water, medicine, and food supplies to the Babylonians, unbeknownst to Enlil, and also taught them how to fish and become self-sufficient. When the Lord of Commands noticed that no one was starving anymore, he immediately accused Ea, because Marduk was ordered by Ea to complete his mission elsewhere before he returned to Babylon. He was most likely afraid Marduk was going to get furious and attack Enlil again if he was let back in Babylon, which was more than plausible. Ea lied and said that the Babylonians had learned themselves how to fish and become self-sufficient. Enlil didn't believe him for 1 second and once again became furious and decided that something needed to be done. The experiment had to come to an end and be restarted all over again, this time under his authority. 11. Atlantean technology at its peak and the Atlantean resistance. In the meantime, technology had reached its peak in the Atlantean Empire. Their scientists had started playing with nuclear energy and set off nuclear bombs in deserted areas, and even in the ocean, very similar to what we have been doing in modern times. Others were exploring the inner earth and stumbled upon ancient beings who resided there, mostly survivors of older experiments, both before the original Terra blew up, and others more recent. The Atlanteans found that the underground world was teeming with intelligent life forms, and huge caverns, tunnel systems, and even cities were everywhere. The priesthood, who still had psychic powers enough to be able to explore other realities, also sensed there were civilizations living there residing in other dimensions. And of course, wars broke out, and conflicts were created. Some of the deep dwellers claimed that those living above ground were intruders and their own species were the rightful heirs of the planet, something that amused some of the humans, while others got insulted. No one, however, took time to find out if the deep dwellers were correct or not. And even if they were, no one would want to admit to it anyway. When the deep dwellers didn't want to allow those from the surface to invade their peaceful territory, the Atlanteans proceeded by force. Troops were sent down to either kill those who were resistant, or threaten to kill them. Either way, the Atlanteans proceeded and explored more and more of the underground worlds. To their great surprise, they found some of the deep dweller being of a totally different genetic setup than themselves, some of them reptilians and reportoids, while others were giants, and some dwarfs and goblin-like. The Atlanteans used laser weapons and even small nuclear weapons to terminate any resistance against the conquerors. However, not everybody in Atlantis agreed to the direction things were taken. There were those who formed resistant groups, training themselves to overthrow some of the Atlantean kings. On occasion, coups were attempted but always failed, leading to smaller civil wars until the resistance was taken care of and those opposing the system were executed. Albeit, there was an even more secret operation behind the scenes. Some much evolved beings within the priesthood could see the ramifications of things and what was inevitable. These beings were incarnated Namliu and Titans, who still had quite some memories intact of ancient times due to that they knew how to get access to them from the Akashic records even though they, too, were born with amnesia. They had certain ways, perhaps we can call it triggers, during their upbringing, which reminded them of whom they were and how to proceed to secretly retrieve forbidden memories. Instead of building groups to overthrow the bloodthirsty governments, they worked with nature, and performed old, sacred rituals, directed descending from the original Mother Goddess religion. They worked with Mother Gaia, Earth, herself in an effort to keep things in balance. This gave humankind some time, but when they realized what Enlil eventually planned, there was very little they could do about it except trying to escape through the grid and certain stargates they managed to open just before hell broke loose. Not all managed to escape, and some are still being recycled/reincarnated here on Earth, but a few succeeded and have ever since overlooked the progress of mankind, up to this very day. They have formed one or more groups in other dimensions and go under many different names. However, none of these names is correct, but still represent the same groups of ascended masters. 12. Enlil's final solution. The solution suddenly came to Enlil. Reports started coming in that A.M.E was rapidly approaching the solar system, and after had calculated its orbit, it looked like the planet was going to come pretty close to Earth this time around. Enlil jumped on this and traveled to what today is close to Cape Horn in South Africa, where the Syrians had a huge astronomical center. He wanted to know exactly what this implied, because it could potentially take care of all his problems. The astronomers said that the ice caps in Antarctica and the Arctic would melt, there would be huge weather changes with earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, and eventually flooding. If they didn't do something, oceans would sweep in over land and take everything with it. Big parts of the world would be flooded, and everybody had to evacuate soon. Fortunately, however, with help from technology and monoliths in space, the scientists could steer the big incoming planet in a slightly different direction and perhaps save Earth. While the whole Syrian science community was working on a solution, an upcoming catastrophe was good news for Enlil. He told the head scientists to hold off on any further attempts to save Earth. The scientists were baffled and protested, but when Enlil got threatening, their voices silenced. Enlil called upon his brother and explained his plans. A.M.E was going to be allowed to come close to Earth and create flooding and weather changes. He told EA that he wanted all humanity and Nephilim to drown in the flood and no one was to be forewarned. As a commander, he ordered EA to obey. Only his own, less developed humans, still working in the mines and as slaves and servants to the gods, were to be saved and taken to high ground or off the planet, temporarily, moved to one of the platforms, circling around Earth. Both Project Elohim and Project Erectus were to be terminated. EA protested loudly and a long arguments followed. Although EA knew that his hands were tied, he had to follow orders, because his brother was in charge. In great fury, EA left Enlil's abode. As the incoming planet came closer, great earth changes started happening. There were sudden, unusual and numerous earthquakes, hurricanes, flooding, tornadoes, and other highly unusual phenomena taking place. EA decided to go against his brother after all, and went to his son Utnapishtim and told him what was about to happen. He told his son to build an ark to save himself, his family, as many people as he could, the ones of fire, and warn others and tell them to quickly move up to the highest grounds they could think of. However, the rest of the population, the absolute majority, were left to perish. When A.M.E approached Earth and reached its closest point, hell broke loose on Earth. Enormous tidal waves swept over the lands and swallowed everything in its way. Millions of people and animals died, not understanding what was going on. The Syrians had already left the planet, and Enlil was quite contempt, not understanding that EA had saved his own men and women of fire. Until A.M.E finally got far enough from Earth to no longer pull on the magnetic field, Earth to a large degree was covered with water. In other places, mountain ranges that had previously been underwater now came to the surface and land and ocean changed position. Then, the water subsided and the land eventually dried out. Those who had survived slowly moved themselves down to lower ground again. And in time, the gods came back and Enlil brought his own humans back to Earth and planned on having them rebuild the planet and start a new species this time. Humans would be less intelligent and more obedient, i.e. there would be no enhanced humans anymore, and EA would not be allowed to recreate them. Little did he know how wrong he was. Little did he know that both enhanced humans and some giants had survived the deluge. When he found out, his rage was beyond imagination.